The air in the Wolf's Lair, Hitler's East Prussian headquarters, was thick with unspoken dread on July 23, 1942. General Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, stood rigidly amidst the controlled chaos of the conference room, his gaze fixed on the Führer. What he had just witnessed was not merely a strategic disagreement, it was a descent into an abyss of irrationality that chilled him to the bone. Adolf Hitler, a figure once revered as a military visionary, had just shredded the painstakingly crafted operational plans for Case Blue, Germany's summer offensive in the Soviet Union. In their place, he scrawled contradictory directives, violating every established principle of military strategy Halder had internalized over 4 decades of service. Yet it wasn't the strategic suicide that paralyzed Halder. It was the man himself. Spittle flecked from Hitler's mouth as he shrieked at his bewildered generals, his face a mottled purple mask of fury. His hands, usually so expressive, trembled uncontrollably, and his left leg twitched a nervous, incessant rhythm. His pupils were disturbingly dilated, perhaps a side effect of the daily methamphetamine injections administered by his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morell. He ranted about elusive Jewish conspiracies, berated his generals for their supposed lack of willpower, and invoked the ethereal concepts of destiny and providence. This was not mere anger, nor even the fiery fanaticism Halder had come to expect. This was something far more terrifying, a raw, undeniable madness. For 2 years, Halder had meticulously constructed excuses for Hitler's increasingly erratic behavior, attributing it to the immense pressures of leadership or an unconventional, albeit brilliant, strategic mind. But now, standing in that suffocating room on July 23, 1942, watching Hitler literally foam at the mouth while ordering the Wehrmacht to simultaneously attack in 2 divergent directions with forces insufficient for either objective, Halder finally, irrevocably, accepted the truth. Germany was being led by a lunatic. This chilling realization rarely dawned upon German generals in a single, blinding flash. Instead, it was an insidious accumulation of incidents, bizarre orders, and decisions that, individually, might have seemed merely eccentric. Collectively, however, they painted a portrait of a mind progressively detached from reality. The path to this recognition varied among the Wehrmacht's leadership, yet certain moments burned brightly as inflection points, times when denial became an untenable luxury. For Field Marshal Fedor von Bock, the hammer blow of truth struck on December 18, 1941, on the frozen outskirts of Moscow. German armies, once seemingly invincible, had advanced to within sight of the Kremlin spires before fierce Soviet counterattacks and the brutal, unforgiving Russian winter forced them into a desperate retreat. Von Bock, commanding Army Group Center, urgently requested permission to conduct tactical withdrawals to more defensible positions, a move that would shorten his perilously overstretched lines and preserve his frostbitten, exhausted troops. Hitler's reply arrived via teleprinter, cold and uncompromising. There will be no retreat. Troops will hold their positions regardless of enemy breakthrough on their flanks or rear. Commanders who order withdrawal without my permission will be court-martialed and shot. Von Bock read the order 3 times, his mind struggling to reconcile the words with any semblance of military logic. This wasn't strategy. It was a decree of suicide masquerading as unwavering determination. German units, with Soviet forces already enveloping their rear, were forbidden to fall back. troops lacking winter equipment, ammunition, or even adequate food were ordered to cling to their positions in temperatures plummeting to 40 degrees Celsius. The order, von Bock knew with absolute certainty, guaranteed the decimation of entire divisions. He immediately protested, his carefully worded military language attempting to convey the catastrophic casualties such an order would incur without achieving any strategic objective. Hitler's response was swift and ruthless. Von Bock was relieved of command. He was replaced by officers who, devoid of critical thought, would implement the insane orders without question. Yet Hitler's no-retreat order, while militarily irrational, wasn't clinically insane in von Bock's eyes. It reflected a terrifying blend of fanaticism and ideological rigidity, not a complete detachment from reality. The truly revealing moment came during his final, curt meeting with Hitler before his dismissal. The Führer spent an excruciating 30 minutes explaining that Soviet resistance was destined to collapse because Slavic peoples were racially inferior and genetically incapable of sustained military effort. When von Bock gently pointed out that Soviet forces had just recaptured Kalinin and Tula, inflicting 50,000 German casualties in the process, Hitler merely waved this away as temporary setbacks caused by disloyal generals. That was when von Bock understood. Hitler wasn't ignoring reality to maintain morale or project an image of confidence. He genuinely believed his own racial ideology superseded observable facts. When reality contradicted Nazi theory, Hitler simply dismissed reality. That wasn't strategic deception or propaganda. That was madness. General Heinz Guderian, arguably the Wehrmacht's most brilliant panzer commander, experienced his stark revelation on March 21, 1943. Guderian had been recalled from disgrace to serve as Inspector General of Armored Troops after Hitler's previous purges of competent commanders. His monumental task was to rebuild the shattered panzer forces devastated at Stalingrad and in North Africa. Guderian prepared comprehensive reports detailing German tank production, losses, and requirements. The mathematics were chillingly straightforward. Germany was producing approximately 600 tanks monthly, while the Wehrmacht was losing approximately 800 tanks monthly on the Eastern Front alone, not even factoring in losses in North Africa, Italy, and to relentless Allied bombing. Simple arithmetic proved an undeniable truth. Germany's armored forces were being annihilated faster than they could be replaced. Guderian presented these sobering figures to Hitler on March 21st, arguing with all his convictions that Germany needed to adopt a defensive strategy until production could possibly catch up with losses. The panzer forces, he stressed, required time to rebuild, retrain, and re-equip. Launching major offensives with inadequate forces would merely accelerate the rate of irreplaceable tank losses. Hitler listened impassively to Guderian's presentation, studying the charts and graphs with a vacant stare. Then, with chilling composure, he explained that the statistics were simply wrong. German production, he asserted, would increase dramatically due to willpower and National Socialist determination. Tank losses would decrease because German soldiers were racially superior. The Soviet Union, he declared, would collapse within months because Bolshevism was inherently weak. Guderian stared at Hitler in utter disbelief. These were not opinions or desperate hopes. Hitler was stating them as irrefutable facts, despite all compelling evidence to the contrary. When Guderian dared to point out that German tank production had actually been declining for 6 months, not increasing, Hitler accused him of defeatism and threatened him with arrest. That was Guderian's moment of unclouded clarity. Hitler wasn't merely strategically incompetent, he was genuinely delusional, constructing an elaborate alternative reality where Nazi ideology dictated outcomes rather than the mundane realities of industrial capacity, logistics, and military force ratios. Guderian realized he was serving a madman who would lead Germany to total destruction, all while insisting until the bitter end that victory was not only possible, but inevitable. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt's moment of recognition arrived earlier than most, during the meticulous planning for Operation Barbarossa in early 1941. Rundstedt commanded Army Group South for the impending invasion of the Soviet Union. During a pivotal planning conference, he posed a seemingly simple, yet profoundly unsettling question to Hitler. What will Germany do if the Soviet Union doesn't collapse after the initial border battles? Hitler looked at Rundstedt as if the question itself was an absurdity. The Soviet Union will collapse, Hitler declared with absolute, unshakable certainty. We have only to kick in the door, and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down. Rundstedt, however, pressed the point. But what if the door doesn't collapse? What if Soviet forces retreat into the vast interior? What if the war continues into winter? Hitler's agitation grew visibly. He vehemently insisted that such scenarios were impossible. The Wehrmacht, he promised, would obliterate the Red Army in 6 to 8 weeks. Moscow would fall. Stalin would be overthrown or flee. The war would end decisively before the arrival of winter. When Rundstedt, perhaps foolishly, dared to mention that Napoleon had harbored similar assumptions before invading Russia in 1812, Hitler exploded. He shrieked that Rundstedt was a defeatist, that the comparison to Napoleon was treasonous, that German racial superiority guaranteed victory. The tirade lasted a terrifying 15 minutes and included explicit threats to relieve Rundstedt of command before the invasion even commenced. General Friedrich Paulus had his revelation later than most, a chilling epiphany brought on by the inferno of Stalingrad in January 1943. Paulus was the epitome of an obedient officer, one who followed orders without question. Even when encircled, even as his Sixth Army starved and froze in the unforgiving Russian winter, he clung to a desperate faith that Hitler's promises of relief would somehow materialize. The moment came on January 24, 1943, when Paulus received a teleprinter notification that Hitler had promoted him to field marshal. The promotion, however, carried a clear, macabre message. No German field marshal has ever surrendered. Hitler expected Paulus to commit suicide rather than capitulate, dragging his entire Sixth Army into a mass death cult. Paulus sat in his frozen basement headquarters, reading the promotion order, the distant cries of his dying, starving soldiers echoing through the icy air. Hitler's message was chillingly transparent. The Führer cared more about preserving the symbolic, mythical facade that German field marshals never surrendered than he did about the lives of 91,000 German soldiers. Rather than authorize a desperate breakout when it was still possible, or permit surrender when continued resistance was utterly pointless, Hitler demanded a theatrical mass suicide. That was when Paulus finally understood. Hitler wasn't making difficult military decisions based on strategic calculations. He was sacrificing an entire army for purely symbolic purposes, living in a fantasy world where theatrical gestures and twisted mythology held more weight than the lives of his fighting men. Paulus surrendered anyway, refusing to participate in Hitler's macabre death cult. The decision haunted him for the rest of his life, but he recognized that obeying such an insane order would have been an even greater sin. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel's moment of recognition unfolded gradually through 1943 and early 1944. Rommel had once been one of Hitler's darlings, the celebrated Desert Fox, whose audacious victories in North Africa had elevated him to a propaganda icon. But Rommel was, at his core, a pragmatic soldier who understood the brutal realities of logistics, supply lines, and realistic assessments of enemy capabilities. After the devastating defeat in North Africa, Rommel was assigned to inspect coastal defenses in France, preparing for the anticipated Allied invasion. He submitted meticulously detailed reports explaining that Germany simply lacked the resources to defend the entire coastline, that Allied air superiority would render effective movement of reserves impossible, and that the only conceivable hope was to defeat the invasion on the beaches within the first 48 hours. Hitler rejected every recommendation. The Führer insisted that German forces would easily repel any invasion attempt, that Allied soldiers were weak and cowardly, and that secret wonder weapons would miraculously ensure German victory. When Rommel presented intelligence assessments showing that Allied invasion preparations involved millions of troops and thousands of ships, Hitler dismissed them as Allied disinformation. The July 20th, 1944, assassination attempt failed. Stauffenberg's bomb wounded Hitler, but did not kill him. The Führer survived, emerging even more paranoid, and spent the final 10 months of his life directing imaginary armies against real enemies. By early 1945, Hitler was ordering counterattacks by divisions that had ceased to exist, expecting relief from armies that had surrendered months earlier, and insisting that victory was mere weeks away, even as Soviet forces fought house to house in Berlin's devastated streets. The generals who survived the war later struggled to articulate why they had continued serving Hitler once they recognized his profound insanity. Some claimed they were bound by their sacred officer's oath. Others argued they hoped to mitigate his worst decisions, believing their presence could somehow avert total catastrophe. Many, with painful honesty, admitted they were simply cowards, too terrified of execution to resist a dictator who held absolute power. But the recognition itself was nearly universal among the Wehrmacht's senior leadership by 1943. Hitler wasn't just strategically incompetent or blindly fanatical. He was genuinely, clinically insane, suffering from some horrifying combination of Parkinson's disease, rampant drug addiction, and profound psychological disorders that manifested as debilitating delusions, acute paranoia, and a complete, irreversible detachment from observable reality. The profound tragedy was that this devastating realization came too late. By the time most generals accepted that their Führer was irrevocably mad, Germany was already irrevocably doomed. The Wehrmacht had been bled white in the vast, unforgiving expanses of Russia. Relentless Allied bombing was systematically destroying German cities and industrial capacity. The Luftwaffe was a defeated, phantom force. The U-boat fleet, once a terror of the Atlantic, was annihilated. No amount of competent generalship, no matter how brilliant, could possibly overcome strategic decisions made by a lunatic over the preceding 3 years. General Halder, who had stood frozen in disbelief during that pivotal July 1942 conference, was dismissed by Hitler in September 1942 for his insufficient fanaticism. He survived the war, but spent the rest of his life haunted by a question he could never adequately answer. Why hadn't he acted when he first recognized Hitler's madness? Why had he continued serving a deranged dictator who was inexorably leading Germany to utter destruction? The answer was agonizingly complex, woven from threads of institutional loyalty, paralyzing fear, willful denial, and the terrifying, almost hypnotic power Hitler wielded over his subordinates. But fundamentally, the German generals failed because they spent too long convincing themselves that what they were witnessing wasn't insanity, but merely unconventional, if ruthless, leadership. By the time denial became utterly impossible, it was far too late to prevent the apocalyptic catastrophe. The exact moment of realization varied for each officer, a deeply personal and often terrifying revelation. Yet, the truth was ultimately universal. Germany's leader wasn't a strategic genius making difficult, albeit brutal, decisions. He was a madman, giving orders to ghost armies, believing his own terrifying delusions, and dragging an entire nation into apocalyptic destruction, while insisting, until the very end, that victory was not only possible, but destined.